episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So we are just about a month into 2026. As the day that this episode comes out, it'll be, I believe it'll be the end of the month. So we'll have 1 month in, and it has been kind of crazy, the number of wild stories that have already come out this year. And at least as of recording, we haven't even gotten to the end of the month yet, so there is technically a chance that something else crops up. And I'm not even getting to touch on all of them because, we have these things called time constraints, which I guess that is kind of a not even a real thing. It's just a construct. This is my own podcast. After all, I can do whatever the heck I want. But in the interest of your time, I usually try to keep these within a set window. If you'll remember back when we did the very first core modules episodes, originally that was just going to be a single episode. And then once the actual runtime for just the clips themselves got to be about 3 hours or so, I was like, okay, yeah, we probably should break this up into a few different episodes, and that's what we did. We're just gonna be hitting the highlights here, but yeah, there is a lot of stuff to get to. But before we get to all that, let's start off with our trivia question for the week, which is, what year was Telnet originally developed? So what year was Telnet originally developed? And if you want a hint, it was developed for the ARPANET, if that helps you narrow it down at all. So before we get into the cybersecurity tip for the week, this was the cybersecurity tip for the week until a larger cybersecurity tip came up literally just yesterday as of recording. But before we get into that, let's start off with this, that you probably shouldn't be using Windows if you care about your privacy and data integrity and security, which on the face of it is kind of like a no dip Sherlock moment, because that Microsoft has been selling advertisements in their operating system for years now. It's no secret. There was the whole scandal over recall that it's just taking screenshots and storing them on your device, and if a threat actor gains access to it, they can look at all those images, and it was a whole mess. But Microsoft has apparently one-upped themselves, because it has just come to light recently this month that Microsoft is giving away BitLocker keys to the government to allow them to decrypt otherwise encrypted data on users' devices. So you heard that right. The government is coming to Microsoft and being like, hey, we have so-and-so's device. Can you give us the BitLocker keys for it? And Microsoft is like, yep, here you go. Now, it's not that black and white, thankfully, but that is, of course, the big headline, which, as it should be, because unlike other companies like Apple, Microsoft is giving the keys away, where Apple's like, yeah, no, we're not going to do that because we actually value customer privacy and security. It's just a core thing. If you violate it once, or you put a backdoor in somewhere, everybody suffers the consequences for that. So the background here, in case you weren't familiar, BitLocker is Microsoft's disk encryption. So it's the same thing if you're on Mac OS, that's FileVault, or Lux on Linux. It's basically a way that you can encrypt your drive, so when you have your computer fully powered off, all of your data is encrypted. So if someone were to remove the drive from your laptop or desktop or whatever and tried to plug it into another device, all they would see is just a bunch of random gibberish because it's all encrypted. So the other good news for Microsoft, or for you in this case if you use Windows, is the FBI first needs a valid legal order in order to request the key. So it's not like they can just be like, this Dark Assassins guy's a little suspect, having a podcast. Hey, Microsoft, can we have his BitLocker keys? Which I don't know, maybe that's happened, but they're obviously not gonna get anything because one, I don't use Windows, and two, well, that's actually not true. I do use Windows, just not frequently. The one computer that I do have Windows that I have BitLocker on, they're not going to be able to get it anyway because the other good news about this story is you have to have your BitLocker key stored in your OneDrive account or somehow connected to your Microsoft ID, account ID, whatever, in order for them to actually give it to the feds. So, which is good news because you have the option when you set up BitLocker to save the key externally to like a flash drive or something. Although it should be noted that the default is just to save it in your Microsoft account, which as it's become evident the past couple years, Microsoft is making it harder and harder to make to log into Windows without a Microsoft account. Like if you're setting up Windows for the first time on a new computer, it's very, very difficult now in order to sign in with a local account. It's basically like cybersecurity, but with creating a local account. So, like in cybersecurity, where it's a never ending arms race, the threat actors find a vulnerability, the software developers patch it, the threat actors find a new vulnerability, the software developers patch it. That's basically what's going on with Windows 11 now. As soon as people find a new way to subvert Microsoft's means of forcing you to sign in with the Microsoft account, Microsoft comes out with a later version of Windows that patches that, and then people have to find other workarounds. It's kind of wild, but the good news here is that yeah, like I said, if you don't save your BitLocker keys to your Microsoft ID or to your OneDrive or whatever, and you just only saved them to like an external flash drive or something, you don't have to worry about this. So the Forbes article that I'll have linked below, they called out that Microsoft receives about 20 requests for BitLocker encryption keys from the FBI a year, but a majority of those requests they're unable to meet because the encryption key was never uploaded to the company's cloud. So that's the good news is if you don't upload your BitLocker keys to Microsoft's cloud, they can't give it to the feds. The bad news is if you do upload it there, Microsoft can just give it to the feds, which you would think if Microsoft actually cared about your privacy and your security and all that good stuff, they would have end-to-end encryption on all your data so they wouldn't even know that your key is in your cloud account, like in your cloud storage. And even if they did find that it was in your cloud storage, they wouldn't be able to access it because all the data would be encrypted. But alas, it appears that such is not the case. So yeah, the last, I guess, bit of good news is there, at least as of right now, there is no credible evidence to suggest that BitLocker somehow has a back door in it that'll allow the government to access your data, regardless of if they have the key or not. At least as of right now, the only evidence to support the government gaining access to people's BitLocker devices is because they already went and asked Microsoft for the keys and then used the keys to unlock the device. So, as far as the encryption goes, there is no evidence to suggest that there is any kind of backdoor built into the encryption, which is obviously good to see. But let this be a warning to you that if you do use Microsoft Windows and you use BitLocker, to make sure that you do not ever put your BitLocker encryption key into the cloud, at least not Microsoft's cloud, because they have proven that they are more than willing to take that key and give it away and basically compromise you. And this doesn't even have to, it doesn't even matter if you're not even doing anything illegal. I mean, there's the whole argument of, well, I have nothing to hide. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, I don't have anything to hide either, but like, like for instance, like if you're, you have a family or something, yeah, you might not have anything to hide, but do you really want the government snooping through all of like your personal family pictures with you and your family? I know I wouldn't. But maybe that's just because I'm a very privacy conscious person. I'm not sure. But yeah, so let this be a kind of a news flash, a pre-cybersecurity tip before the cybersecurity tip. Now, speaking of the cybersecurity tip, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So, this week's cybersecurity tip is if you operate one of the around 800,000 Telnet servers that still exist on the internet, stop. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, we've known for a long time that Telnet isn't really the best because it's not encrypted. And I mean, that's part of it. And yes, that's why you shouldn't use it. But it came to light literally this week, as I am recording this episode, that there is a 10-year-old authentication bypass vulnerability that has existed in Telnet. So since 2015, there has been a vulnerability in Telnet, specifically the GNU iNet utils package, that would allow a threat actor to log into your Telnet server as root and bypass all authentication. Now, this article here, it's according to the Shadow server, which they're an identity security watchdogs. They basically just kind of scan the internet for things. They track nearly 800,000 IP addresses with Telnet fingerprints. So, in other words, around 800,000 servers out there with Telnet running that is accessible, which is kind of a big yikes because, as we discussed, Telnet is not secure at all. Because it's not encrypted, if you connect to a Telnet server over the internet, all of your keystrokes that you send and all the responses that get sent back to you are in plain text. So theoretically, anybody sniffing that connection would be able to see everything that's going back and forth between you and that server. So, not a very secure or very good way of doing things. But like I said, if you're not if you're using Telnet, which you shouldn't be, but if you're using a non-GNU iNet utils version of Telnet, I don't think it's affected. It's only the GNU iNet utils package, specifically version 1.93 to anything below 2.8 that's affected. So let's walk through briefly how this exploit works. And it's probably one of the simplest exploits I've ever seen in my life. Now, usually when you hear about, 0 days and remote code execution vulnerabilities and, these really bad ones that allow threat actors to basically get root access, there's usually some kind of tomfoolery that they have to do, some kind of memory manipulation and input. They have to give a very specific input to like jump around in the code and bypass like address space randomization and all these funky tricks. No, this is literally a one line command and you're in. It does not get any simpler than this. Like, all that, click clacking away on the keyboard that Hollywood likes to depict as quote unquote hacking, this is basically the exact opposite of that. It is the antithesis of Hollywood hacking. It is literally a copy paste job and you're in. So how this works is you set your user environment variable on your local system to be -f space root. So -f and then root. You set that as your user environment variable. Then you log into a Telnet server by passing the flag -a or --login, and you're in. You're in as root. Congratulations. That's literally all you have to do. You set an environment variable and then you telnet into a server passing it the -a flag and you're in. Yes. That is literally all you have to do. So the fact that this was lying dormant for 10 years is kind of mind-boggling, but at the same time, if nobody's actually using it, it's not that, surprising that it lasted that long, right? Like if you see say an open source project, which I mean this is, you see an open source project that nobody uses, right? Like you have your own open source project that you created yourself. Nobody uses it. It's just you. Welcome to the club, by the way. It probably not many people are going to catch any security vulnerabilities because there aren't a bunch of eyes on the code because not a lot of people are using it or looking at it. But to break down how this actually bypasses all the authentication involved and gets you root access, we have to break down what's going on and what the flags actually do. So the dash A or the dash dash login flag basically bypasses the typical login to perform an automatic login based on the user environment variable. So if you, for instance, if you look at the man page for Telnet, that's basically what the dash A flag says it does is it tries to do a automatic login, kind of assuming that you're already authenticated, so you're just logging in with that user. And then the reason why the dash F root thing works is because when you pass that user environment variable, what Telnet was doing under the hood was taking that user environment variable and appending it at the end of the user slash bin slash login command and then performing the authentication that way. So what was happening is if you look at the man page for user slash bin slash login, the dash F signifies bypass authentication since the user is already pre-authenticated. And then the root at the end is you specifying what user you want to be. So if you look at so that's literally what the login man page says. So login, it takes, some flags, and then it takes the user you want to log in as. So in this case, you're doing the dash F, so bypass the authentication because the user's already pre-authenticated. Oh, and by the way, the user is root. So you set your environment variable as the flags to log in to the login, program, and you pass that into Telnet through your user environment variable, and bam, you're logged into that server as root. Absolutely mind-boggling. So this is a textbook example of why you always have to validate your user input. Even if it's coming from an environment variable, you always have to sanitize your input. Otherwise, something like this happens. So this is literally, like I said, an exploit anyone could do. I mean, probably the most advanced part of this procedure is setting your user environment variable, which isn't really even all that hard. You could probably just create a script to auto set that for you, give it to someone, and they can log in wherever they want to. Because that's typically setting environment variables is not necessarily something novice or beginner computer users do, but literally the fact of doing Telnet with the dash A flag, that is absolutely a copy and paste job for sure. So yeah, but the good news is there is already a patch out there. So if you update your Telnet to version 2.8, it's fixed in that version. But let this just be another reason, if you didn't already have enough, to not use Telnet anymore. Um, because, I mean, the fact that this exploit, like I said, has been around for 10 years is kind of crazy. I'd be interested to know how many times or if this was even exploited before it became public knowledge. But one thing that is kind of funny is if the amount of instances of this attempted exploit being used in the wild, because people are like, oh, this exists. It's very new. Let's try to log into all these Telnet servers. Let's scan all the Telnet servers on the internet and try to use this exploit to log into them as root, because that's definitely what all the bots are going to be doing right now. And that's what traffic has shown. There has been a massive spike in this attack, essentially, which is not surprising. That's kind of always happens when a big vulnerability like this comes out. But yeah, the good news is it's fixed. The bad news is it's been around. It was around for 10 years, and there are still over 800,000 people using Telnet. So those are the two downsides. But the good news is there's a fix, and you now have another reason why you should not be using Telnet. and that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. So, another thing I like to do on this podcast is clown on Google. Now, we already clowned on Microsoft a little bit, but clowning on Google is one of the things I definitely enjoy. So, Google had another big oof this month. People like to always complain that their device is listening to them. There's the old adage of, I was having a conversation with so and so about this, and then I, logged into my insert social media of choice and I saw an ad for that exact thing that I was talking about. My phone is listening to me. Well, you might actually not be crazy because Google just settled a 608 or 68, excuse me, $68 million lawsuit where people accused Google of doing exactly that. Now, if you've ever used Google before, you're probably well aware of the fact that Google loves to harvest any bit of information they can get on you and then sell it to the highest bidder for advertising. But the claim here was that Google illegally recorded and shared private conversations after Google's Assistant was triggered in order to send them targeted advertising. Now, if this sounds familiar to another giant tech company, you would be correct because Apple had a similar case filed against them, which they also settled. In their case, it was for $95 million, which I guess in this case, Google's kind of making out like a bandit here. But again, for Google, I mean, what's $68 million? That's kind of pocket change for them, right? I mean, the amount of money they're making on selling people's data, pocket change. But anyway, Apple had their lawsuit settled back in December of 2024 for Siri for basically the exact same thing. But it's good to see that Google is now getting the same treatment and getting slapped as well. But we should of course clarify here because to Google's credit, and according to them, they deny all wrongdoing in the situation, which of course they do. But they agreed to settle to make the problem go away, or in more official terms, so they would not have to risk litigation. So you can take that as you will, but I think anyone that's used Google, like I mentioned, is probably has a good idea that whether or not this is something that Google is actually doing, that being listening to you or taking your personal information and selling that off to advertisers. I think most people that have used Google probably have already come to their own conclusions on if Google is guilty or not, but we do have to take Google's statement for what it's worth, that is. And they do, in fact, deny all wrongdoing in this situation. So, according to them, they were not listening to their users and selling it to the highest bidder for advertising. Though the people that filed the lawsuit would disagree, but I will let you be the judge of that. If you've listened to the podcast long enough, you probably already know what my opinion on the situation is. But again, there technically was no official ruling from a judge saying that Google did this. So, you know, I guess touche, Google. I don't know. Um, but with that, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So there's a few things that I wanted to touch on here. The first one was actually something I was considering putting into creating an open source highlight for this episode, um, but because the thing I'm going to talk about technically has a GitHub, but there's no source code there. And I tried to find the source code and I wasn't really successful, so I opted not to put this as an open source highlight, but nonetheless, I still wanted to talk about it anyway. So I mentioned last year that I kind of created a unofficial, and now it's kind of an official tradition for myself of reading and listening to the Ready Player One series around the holidays. But this year I done goofed because when I synced my phone to my Mac Mini, I neglected to sync my audiobooks to my phone. So when I was getting ready to tune in to the books, I realized that I did not have them. And that was a kind of a big bummer. So I was trying to figure out different ways that I could go about solving this problem. What my last ditch effort was, I have all the audio files saved on my NAS. So worst case is I can just VPN into my house, download the audio files, and just play them that way, which wouldn't be ideal, but would technically get the job done. Um, but then I found this app called Plappa, I think is what it's called, Plappa. I'll have it linked in the show notes, so you don't have to worry about trying to remember that. Um, but this tool basically allows you to sync and listen to your audiobooks that you host on Jellyfin or Audio Bookshelf. I don't use Audio Bookshelf, but I do have Jellyfin, so I figured I'd try to give this a shot. The app is free; it's on the App Store, so you don't need to pay for it. Although, as we'll get into a little bit later, there is a way that you can pay for it and support the developers, and that does give you a couple benefits. But just to use the app and stream your audiobooks, you don't need to pay for it; it's completely free. So I personally didn't have Jellyfin set up for audiobooks. But that was very simple because all I had to do was go into Jellyfin and add a books label thing in Jellyfin. There's a way that you can add audiobooks in Jellyfin, so I just went in, did that, pointed to where my audiobooks were, and bada bing, bada boom. Everything was good. I pointed Plappa to my Jellyfin server, logged in, and there all my audiobooks were ready to stream. Even when I wasn't home, because I could just connect to my VPN, and I was able to connect to the Jellyfin server and listen to my audiobooks. So shout out to Home Labs coming in clutch, saving my traditions. Um, so this is the other thing that I do like about this app, which is why I really, really wanted to make it an open source highlight. Was according to the website, it is written in Swift UI. It is a native iOS app, not any of that garbage JavaScript Flutter garbage. It's actually a native app, which I do very much appreciate. Now, though, I did touch on that you can pay for the app, so it's free to download and it's free to use. But if you want to download your audiobooks for offline listening, so i.e., if you're away from your house and you don't have a way to VPN it into your house, you could download them directly to your device and listen to them elsewhere. But in order to do that, they either have the lifetime plan, which is $4.99, or you can subscribe for a yearly purchase of $1.99, and that will allow you to just download the books locally. Which honestly, like, it's not. I think it's honestly a pretty good deal, especially like the $5 for the lifetime. Especially if you listen to a lot of audiobooks and you like to, go between syncing them and having them locally. This is, I think, is a great way to do that. It's a lot less hassle of having it, what I was doing before, having to sync my phone to my computer to load the audiobooks on. I could literally just put them where I would normally put them and then just download them to my phone, which is pretty cool. Um, and honestly, I mean, it's a great way to support developers too, because this was another reason why I was really hoping I could see like the source code, because this is what I think is probably a pretty good open source model. Um, because there's always a question when it comes to open source projects is how do you fund them? Because by nature of it being open source, all of the code is freely available for anyone to download and use. So it kind of makes it hard to monetize that, right? So one way that uh Plappa's doing, and which I guess technically I haven't been able to find their source code, but take BitLocker for instance. BitLocker is open source. It allows you to run your own instances, but they also charge for like some premium features. And also, if you want to use like their own hosted services, they can kind of make some money that way. But this, just kind of either a subscription model, which I know I hate subscriptions, but kind of a lifetime purchase as well. Doing it that way to kind of monetize it, but not making it forced upon you, I think is kind of a good neutral ground for supporting kind of like open source development. But yeah, I just kind of liked the convenience of being able to sync audiobooks to my phone without actually having to manually download them and sync them from my computer, which was definitely feasible, but also kind of annoying. As we saw, if you forget to do it, you're kind of out of luck. In this case, if you forget to do it, well, you can just stream it. So it's not a big deal. So, yeah, if you're interested, I'll have links to their GitHub, which is basically just a README, and their actual website if you're interested. So, one of the other things that I wanted to talk about was something I happened to come across on accident, and that is that DuckDuckGo has numerous Easter eggs to display depending on what you search for. So, if you search for very specific keywords, the duck up in the top left corner will actually change its appearance. So, for instance, I happen to have been watching the original 1982 Tron film recently. And when I searched Tron and DuckDuckGo, I noticed that the logo was different, which I thought was rather interesting. It kind of looked like the Tron character, which I thought was kind of cool. So then that kind of led me down the rabbit hole of trying to investigate what other Easter eggs exist within the DuckDuckGo search engine. And boy, there are a lot of them. So, for instance, there's Tron, obviously. There's one for Ketchum, a cyborg, a cowboy, all kinds of good stuff. Basically, all the major sports teams. I mean, but the one thing to kind of be mindful of is you do have to search with only that name explicitly. So like you just have to search explicitly Tron or Ash Ketchum. Otherwise, you probably won't get the desired effect. But regardless, I thought that this was pretty darn cool because as a software engineer, uh, one thing I love when I happen to stumble across these kinds of Easter eggs. Now, especially when I never knew they existed before. Like in video games, for instance, if you're kind of looking around online and you see like, exploits you can perform in video games or other Easter eggs, and then you perform them yourself, yeah, they're cool. But there's an additional coolness factor when you discover it yourself without anybody else telling you about it, which I think is absolutely incredible. I love when that happens because as a professional software engineer, I have hidden my fair share of Easter eggs in the code I've written before, just kind of minor stuff, things that most people wouldn't even notice, usually like default values, that kind of a thing. But to actually see them in practice is incredible, awesome, and I love to see it. And like I said, especially this one in particular, because I discovered it on my own, and nobody told me about it. And then the last thing I want to touch on briefly is wow, Apple Silicon is one power efficient boy. So over the holidays, like I think a lot of people, I did some traveling, and part of that included flying on an airplane. And I decided to do what I usually do, which is take my laptop with me, load up some movies on it that I downloaded from my NAS, and then watch them on the flight. And usually the flight that I took, it typically when I was using my old 2017 MacBook Pro, it would drain about like 40% of the battery or so for the duration of the flight. I would be probably watching a movie for anywhere between like 2 to 3 hours or so. So probably around like 2.5 hours or so. So drained about 40% in 2.5 hours. So not terrible, not great, but it's definitely more than enough to be able to watch the movies on the flight with. So this was the first flight that I took the MacBook Air on that I watched movies on it with, and I kid you not, my laptop was at 100% when I pulled it out of my bag to start watching the movie. And when it was time for me to put my laptop away, I figured, okay, we've been watching the movie for like just around 2 hours or so, maybe a little more than that. So, I don't know, maybe dropped like 5-10%. Nope, it dropped a single percent. It was at 99% remaining by the time that I had to put my laptop back in my backpack, which was kind of wild I'm not even going to do the math, but that is a massive percent increase in terms of battery life performance. And I guess that's kind of to be expected, since like the video playback, like if you're just doing video playback, no like streaming or anything, which is literally what I was doing. So like the optimal battery scenario, um I was getting, in like 2 hours dropped a single percent, which, I mean, I guess that kind of tracks with, I think, what Apple advertises. I don't remember exactly what their battery life numbers are, but it was basically somewhere between like 18 to 20 some hours of battery life is kind of what they advertise, with like video playback being like that higher tier one. So, I mean, that does kind of track. And it was just very refreshing and cool to see how little the battery dropped. So, the last story that I wanted to talk about, which caught my attention for this month, is Apple's plans to use Google's Gemini for Siri. Now, as a quick recap, back when Apple back when Apple launched, or I guess rather they announced Apple Intelligence over a year and a half ago at the 2024 WWDC, they originally said that they were going to use ChatGPT as a fallback, and other models will follow. Well, it turns out those other models are here. But I mean, we also have to kind of address the elephant in the room, that Apple Intelligence never really got off the ground like it was advertised anyway. Um, Specifically, all the impressive things that it could do. The fact that you could say, check my email for when Bob's flight is set to arrive and book him an Uber to take us to this restaurant and make us a reservation. Like, a very complex ask of an AI, which was promised at WWDC in 2024, but has yet to arrive. That was kind of one of the promises of it. So I think the hope is that Gemini will get them there. Now, and Google have made a deal that Apple will base its AI models off Google's Gemini model for all future instances of Apple Intelligence, which I do find it kind of ironic in a sense, because here's Apple making this big deal with Google literally on the heels of April of 2025, when Google was slapped with a ruling that it violated antitrust law due to them being a monopoly because of the deals that they were making. Yet they go ahead and make another big deal like this, which I find kind of funny, because Apple was a central figure in that antitrust lawsuit. Because it came to light that Google was paying Apple billions, with a B, billions of dollars a year to make Google the default search engine on all Apple devices in Safari. So it's quite bold of them that in less than a year, here they go again, making another big deal with Apple so Apple can use their AI models. Now, it should be noted that it is unclear on who exactly is paying who in this case. There are no specific details about the deal that have made public, although according to the Lord and Savior of Apple Leaks, aka Mark Gurman of Bloomberg, Apple will be the one paying Google around $1 billion a year for access to the models. Now, whether that's going to actually be Apple paying Google a billion, or Apple just negotiated with Google that Google doesn't have to pay them, just basically cut off a billion from your Google bill that you pay us to make Google the default search engine. I don't know. I mean, like I said, no actual details have been made public about the deal. All we know is from what Mark Gurman said, which, according to him anyway, Apple will be paying Google a billion. But I mean, if you already have multiple deals with a company, it's like, are you actually paying them that money, or do you just take some money off the bigger deal, right? Like I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, if you owe me $20 and I have to pay you $10, you still technically just owe me $10. So what if we just drop the price of you owing me $20 to $10 and I pay you nothing, because the same amount of money would change hands? So who knows what the actual parts of the deal is. But anyway, if you're like me and you don't want Google anything to do with Google, you don't want to touch anything to do with Google with a 10-foot pole, there is some good news here. So, one thing to note is that when it comes to AI models, the actual models themselves aren't the data hungry pigs that suck up all your queries and responses and use them to sell you ads or for future training data. That's all just the platforms themselves. So, for instance, you can go on to like one of the various like AI model hubs, like Hugging Face is one, and download a bunch of these like AI models. And if you run them locally, you don't have to worry about the model siphoning off your data to some third party. Now, if you use one of the actual AI platforms themselves, like Gemini, OpenAI, ChatGPT, well, I guess not OpenAI, ChatGPT, Claude, one of those, then yes, your data is absolutely being siphoned off to that company and they are using your data to train their models and to potentially sell advertisements and all that good stuff. But because in this case, Apple is just using Google's models. They're not actually using Google's Gemini platform necessarily. They're just using the models that underlie it. So think of an AI model like a movie. If you're just watching, rewinding, or skipping parts of the movie, as far as the movie file itself is concerned, that doesn't mean anything. The movie file is just doing what it does and showing you what part of the movie you want to watch. But if you then try to stream that same movie from like a streaming service, they are absolutely going to see how much of the movie you watched. Did you rewind to certain parts? Did you rewatch certain parts? Did you skip certain parts? All of that to feed their algorithms to try to identify what you would be most interested in to watch next. So it's not the actual file that's the problem. It's not the AI model that's the data hungry problem. It's the platform the model is on that is the data hungry problem. So, just like with the movie, if you download a movie file, your data is not being sold anywhere. If you stream that movie file, I guess it kind of depends on the platform you're using. Um, so it's the same thing with AI models, right? If you host your own AI models on your own infrastructure like I do, you don't have to worry about them spying on you. So in this case, Apple is hosting these models in their own private cloud platform, which as they mentioned in WWDC in the keynote, it is a private and secure platform. And to make their private cloud compute, to basically put their money where their mouth is, they one made the private cloud compute source code open so anyone could take a look at it, and they also put a bounty program out there for anyone to prove otherwise, that you could demonstrate that you can access user request data or sensitive info about the user's request, and basically kind of get information about the user, because that was one thing that Apple touted with their their private cloud compute platform is, yes, you're sending your data to the cloud, but we're not harvesting that. We don't know anything about it. We're just processing the request and sending you back the response. So kind of the whole point of their bounty program was to be like, this is our claim. Anyone, you're more than welcome to prove us wrong. And at least as far as I know, nobody has managed to collect on said goal. No one has managed to collect on the bounty, which I think the top prize was like $1 million or something like that. Like there was some insane money being thrown around. If you could demonstrate some of the different things were not correct that Apple was claiming. So, but like I said, as far as I know, I don't think any of those rewards have actually been collected. So, plus, the goal of Apple Intelligence was to run as much of the models on device as possible. So, i.e., you ask Siri for a request, and Siri will process all of that on your phone locally without sending anything to the cloud or sending anything back to Apple. It all happens locally on your iPhone, MacBook, iPad, whatever. Um, so once you have the AI models, you can basically do whatever you want to them. Like you can tweak the models to suit your own needs, and kind of build upon them and make them more specialized. So what Apple seems to be planning on doing is taking Gemini kind of as a base, at least for now anyway, and then kind of building on that, adding their own stuff on top, kind of adding their own Apple flair to it, their own Apple flavor to it, to make it more of their own. But at the end of the day, the underlying source is the Gemini model, but they're obviously going to add their own tweaks. Now, What Apple I think is still planning on doing is to kind of use this as a training purpose, like to kind of help them improve their own models so they don't have to use Gemini in the future. But really, at the end of the day, all this is to say that Apple is going to be using Google's models, but that doesn't mean that Siri requests are going to be going straight to Google. It's basically the exact opposite in this case. So, like I was kind of alluding to there, according to Gurman himself, Apple only plans to use Gemini as a stopgap to help improve its own models to the point where they can fully switch to them and not be reliant on any third party models. So that's kind of, the goal here is, which I mean, that's kind of the goal of any like even if you are trying to become better at something, right? Whether that's playing the guitar, writing code, becoming an artist, you're probably going when you're first starting out, you're probably going to be heavily reliant on other sources of inspiration or other sources of that thing being done before you feel confident and good enough to just kind of do it on your own, right? So, like, if you're an artist, for example, you want to be an aspiring artist, probably what you're going to do to start out is you're going to find works that you're interested in and try to kind of recreate those. Similar with coding, you'll find um, snippets of code or programming examples that you want to try to emulate and try to work on that before you kind of go out and do your own thing. So that's kind of what Apple's trying to do here with Gemini is the plan is to kind of use that as a stopgap to help them improve their own models so then they can just ditch it entirely. How long that's going to take, who's to say? But that is, at least according to Gurman, what the plan is. Now, all of this has kind of apparently thrown OpenAI into quite the tailspin. Another case of OpenAI's empire and dominance of AI in the AI space starting to crumble. So, allegedly, Apple came to this decision to switch to Gemini because it improved enough that it had a large enough user base where Gemini was now better than ChatGPT. Since that was one of the reasons why Apple went with ChatGPT initially when they announced Apple Intelligence back in 2024, because according to them back then, ChatGPT was just the best available on the market. Now, whether that was actually true back then or OpenAI just paid Apple money to do it, and maybe it was kind of true, but money talks, or that was actually the case. I mean, who's to say for certain? But at least now, um, Apple apparently thinks that Gemini is the better solution. And at least according to the deal, according to Mark Gurman, it's not like Google's paying them money to do that. According to Mark Gurman, Apple is the one paying Google. So, I mean, I guess take that as you will. But back in the day, OpenAI and ChatGPT were basically your all-stop shop for all needs AI. It was kind of like Netflix before the streaming wars. Now, not so much, apparently. Apparently, Sam Altman, who is the OpenAI CEO, apparently declared a quote code red in December to better address and respond to Google's Gemini 3 release. So apparently, OpenAI is kind of shaking in their boots, I guess. Their timbers are shivering. Shiver me timbers, I guess, is kind of what they're thinking. And I mean, that's kind of what tends to happen, I guess, when a market kind of explodes. You have the first one onto the scene, which in the streaming wars, that was basically Netflix. And then in the AI space, it was kind of OpenAI with ChatGPT. But as we kind of seen with the streaming wars, I'm not going to say Netflix has fallen off, but they're definitely not like the dominant powerhouse that they used to be. Like, because back in the day, it used to be, oh, you just subscribe to Netflix and then you have everything. Um, Nowadays, you have to subscribe to Netflix, HBO Max, Disney Plus, Peacock, all these other streaming services because one doesn't have them anymore because companies were like, hey, what if instead of licensing it to a certain streaming service, we just create our own so people have to come to us? I mean, that's basically what happened. It's honestly kind of a miracle that someone out there hasn't created a service to auto manage your subscriptions to all of these streaming services. So you only pay a single fee to a single company, and you can kind of pick and choose what streaming services you subscribe to. Um, Now, if this sounds a little bit like cable, that's exactly right, because it's honestly a miracle that someone hasn't reinvented cable yet, because that's essentially what cable was doing, right? Like cable subscriptions was basically just bundling up all of these different channels into a one-stop shop for you to pay a single fee rather than having to pay individually for all these different cable things. So if you actually kind of break it down, like how much your cable plan was versus how much each one of the different, I guess, networks cost, it was kind of like mini subscriptions, but it was all bundled into one. So it's kind of a miracle that someone hasn't had the brilliant idea to basically reinvent cable, but for streaming services. I mean, Disney Plus is kind of doing it. They have like the Disney Plus, Hulu, and ESPN Plus bundle, and I think some other companies that kind of own like a couple streaming services are kind of doing similar things. But it's kind of I'm just waiting for the day that some startup out there or something comes up with this grand idea to basically make deals with the various streaming services, or somehow comes up with a way that you can link different streaming services into this singular platform to like kind of handle all the payments for you. So it essentially you're paying to a single entity, and it's distributing your payments for all the streaming services accordingly. I'm just waiting for the day that that happens. But I don't think it's here yet. But I feel like it's an inevitability at this point. But I guess we shall see. So all of the different stories and everything that I talked about, I have linked in the show notes if you care to dive deeper into any of them. But before we go for today, we should wrap up with our trivia question, which is, what year was Telnet originally developed? And remember, the hint for that was it was developed originally for ARPANET, or for the ARPANET. If you said 1969, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And when you take it into that perspective, that Telnet was created in 1969, it kind of makes sense that it doesn't have any kind of encryption or anything, because back then, the idea of security or cybersecurity in general didn't really exist. And the quote unquote security that existed back in the day was basically security through obscurity. If you don't know it exists, you can't do anything about it. So I guess in that sense, it kind of makes sense. And if you put it in that perspective, it makes sense why Telnet does not have the encryption capabilities and is generally advised not to be used because of that in the modern day. But yeah, that's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed it, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review, and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share with a friend or family member that you think might enjoy it. We had a lot to cover in this episode. And if you have any questions about this episode, or if you have any topics or ideas for future episodes, definitely shoot me an email at contact@darkassassins.inc.com. Or if you're on YouTube, you can just leave a comment down below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.